So thankful for people like Amy and Michelle and Justin who helped organize this. And thank you, by the way, to all of you, all the adults who brought your kids to make sure that they learned those songs. So I just really want to thank you for that opportunity, because it's one of those things that I hear about quite a bit. I'm fortunate enough that both my wife, Morgan, and my exchange daughter, Yulia, who's from Poland, volunteer in Kids Venue pretty regularly. And they find so much joy. They share with me some of these things that they do. And by the way, if you're ever like, I would like to maybe volunteer with them and kind of see that joy happen firsthand. I know Amy would always love to talk to you about how you can volunteer and kind of see the way that plays out, seeing kind of the intergenerational differences that you get an opportunity to make each and every week. Interestingly enough, speaking of Yulia and being an exchange student and different ways that people have interacted with people from different cultures, a number of years ago, my wife and I lived in the country of Morocco. And while we were there, I was teaching English, and one of my coworkers, in fact, one of the other English teachers, was a gentleman by the name of Khalid Barouk. And I want to show you a picture of Khalid. This was actually just a few months ago when he was awarded his PhD. And Khalid and I had a very great relationship while we were there. He's actually one of maybe the smartest people that I've ever met. He grew up in kind of an area of Fez, Morocco that was very underprivileged. And he decided that in order for him to both be able to get out and to give back, that one of the things that he wanted to make sure he was able to do is that he needed to learn English. And so starting when he was just a young boy, he would go into his neighborhood library and he would check out books that were in English and he would try to learn that, which is, by the way, one of the multitude of reasons that libraries are sacred spaces, right? We have some people here who are librarians and they are heroes, by the way, so thank you so much for, thank you so much for the way that those things happen. And then he would also learn English by doing a couple of other things, like watching American sitcoms. And so he watched a lot of Friends. And so he kind of learned English that way. And then he was really into the show Suits. And so he's really excited about Suits, the LA version that's getting ready to come out. But that was one of the ways that he really learned English. And one of the things that is interesting about Khalid with me is that we still send each other text messages fairly regularly, especially when Morocco is playing in the World Cup. And every time that we send each other a text message, we always call each other the same thing. We call each other Khoya. And Khoya is the word in the main language that is in Morocco, Darija, that means brother. It's this word that just says, transcending everything else, you are my brother. And what's really interesting to me about this whole process is that when Morgan and I had to leave Morocco because of some circumstances that were going on, my dad had recently been diagnosed with dementia, and when we came back, I got really, really sick. And there was this very interesting phenomenon that happened that really highlighted a difference that I wasn't expecting to see. You see, there were several people that we taught with in Morocco who were from the United States. They spoke English as a primary language. We even went to church with most of them. And when everything kind of fell apart, those who were our Christian friends completely ghosted us. And to make matters worse, some of them even went further to post disparaging things about the fact that we weren't there anymore. And it really hurt. Meanwhile, there's a group of individuals who we still talk to, who consistently were messaging us to make sure things were okay, who were checking in on my dad. And these individuals were mostly Muslims. They were mostly our friends who did not speak English as a primary language. They were individuals who were from Morocco originally, not from the United States. And when everything hit the fan, they were the ones who really showed what compassion, what kindness, what generosity looked like. It was really complicated for me, right? It was really complicated in the sense that there was this group of individuals that I had often been taught were the others, right? I grew up here in Southwest Missouri. I went to SBU for both undergrad and grad school. I was there in September of 2001, and I remember the ways that many people, both through implicit and explicit bias, told us to deal with our Muslim brothers and sisters. But what's interesting to me is how different the lived experience actually changed so many things around us. If we're honest with ourselves, there are probably several groups of people that in all of our past, we were kind of taught this about, weren't there? The people maybe when you were a kid and you were in a car and your parents said something like, now when you see someone who looks like that, make sure you roll up your windows and you lock your doors. Or the uncomfortableness that some people still see when someone walks down an airplane aisle wearing a turban, and you start to see people kind of squirming in their seats. Funny to me that in our best times, we don't do this, do we? You know, you never see a time that in a new birthing wing at a hospital, there are people sitting around arguing about politics. They don't argue about religion. They don't argue about race or gender, sexual orientation, anything like that. They're just really excited there's a baby. And everyone will tell each other that their baby is so cute, even if it's not. And the exact opposite of the joy that so many people feel in a newborn wing, this also happens, right? Because the opposite of a newborn wing with joy is obviously the DMV. I was just at the DMV a couple of weeks ago, by the way, and it was right after the election, and there was a huge line. I was there for over an hour just trying to get my driver's license renewed. And shockingly, during that time, no one argued about politics. No one argued about our differences. All that we wanted was for the line to move faster. And believe it or not, us arguing about it and us talking about it didn't make it happen. And actually, it's kind of in that setting that is why we've been doing the series that we've been doing here over the last month. This concept of Away in a Laundromat, where we've been kind of looking at what the Christmas story might look like if it had happened in 2024. Where are the people who might have shown up at what we would have grown up maybe calling the manger that we're kind of thinking about as 21st century the laundromat? The people who maybe, for example, are like the shepherds who are the outsiders who often get excluded. Like the individuals like the Herod character that Philip spoke about last week. And today, we're going to talk about another set of these characters that show up in this place, much like the laundromat that I went to in college, where it didn't matter what your background was. It didn't matter if you were a hard science person or a soft science person or a college dropout or a professor or whatever. Everyone went there for one reason, which was to get their clothes cleaned. And today we're going to be looking at a small group of individuals that we've often called the wise men or the magi. And we're going to be talking, and I think that as we do this over the next, say, 20 minutes or thereabouts, I hope that not only will we start to see ways that maybe we have a lot more in common in this laundromat that we all live in, but maybe we can also learn a little bit about ourselves and the love that we can express to each other. The story that we're going to be reading comes out of the book of Matthew in the Christian scripture. If you think about the Christmas story that many of us know, it largely comes out of two stories in the Christian New Testament. One is Matthew, who was a Jew who was mostly writing to a Jewish audience, and he focused a lot on the royalness of Jesus and a lot on the history and the genealogy because he wanted to demonstrate Jesus as this almost king-type character. And Luke, on the other hand, was a Greek who was mostly writing to Greeks and largely talking about how the outsiders were accepted. And so it's kind of in that context of understanding how the story was written that we start to read the story today. And it shows up in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, and it says this, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. And about that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." So when these wise men, and actually before we dive into that, it's probably actually better that we call them the Magi. The New Testament was mostly written in Greek. There's actually only one word in the New Testament that's written in Persian, and it's this word. It's the word Magi. And I think it's important for us to note that because the Magi were probably in reference to a very specific grouping of people They were the priestly class of a religion called Zoroastrianism that was practiced in what we would kind of call modern-day Iran, the Persian region at the time, that started in about the 6th century BCE. And when they show up, it seems like they're asking a pretty interesting question. They say, where is this newborn king of the Jews? And when I was little, I'm not going to lie, I think most of us, when we think about this, we think, oh, they were asking where baby Jesus is, right? Where's the baby? But new scholarship has seemed to indicate maybe that wasn't actually their question at all, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the word newborn isn't actually there. It's a way that we've kind of helped ourselves process it. Instead, what most scholars now think is what they were actually asking potentially is, where is the one who was born king of the Jews? In other words, it wasn't a question of where the baby was born, but rather a question of who the baby was born to be. It was a very subversive question, potentially. In other words, and I could be way wrong here, but it seems like maybe what the Magi were doing here was asking this question because King Herod was not born king of the Jews. King Herod was appointed king of the Jews by the Roman Empire in 37 BCE. And it seems like what they might have been asking is, why is the world order that we're living in the way it is? Is it possible that there's a space that the Jews need self-determination and that their leader is the one who was rightfully born in that space, not one that was appointed by outsiders? It's a question that many people are kind of wrestling with right now, honestly. Like, where does leadership come from and how do you deal with this? By the way, it's probably part of the reason Herod got so upset. They were asking, why do you get to be the leader instead of this one? You know, in kind of some ways, it reminds me of the fact that right now, with everything that's going on with Israel and Palestine, there are a lot of people asking questions of like, what does it look like to support different people? And there was a quotation that's been making the rounds lately from Greek Orthodox Archbishop Theodosa Atala Hana. And he says this. He says, I am a Palestinian Christian. We also say Allah Akbar, which you normally hear from Muslims, as well as Inshallah, Mashallah, and Alhamdulillah. This is simply because Arabic is our language. And the Arabic word for God is Allah. And that's true whether you're a Christian or a Muslim. You see, when we use different words to express our thoughts, to express our theology, to express our belief system, to express love, to express the divine, sometimes people can get confused by that. Here at the venues, you will sometimes hear us refer to God as the word God. Sometimes you'll hear us refer to God as the divine, the Christ within us. You'll hear us refer to God sometimes in a gender-neutral way or even using words like she. And sometimes people get confused about that or maybe even frustrated. And actually, I think that's the first thing that we can start to learn from this story of the Magi, and that's this, that sometimes people with different perspectives make us uncomfortable, especially if we don't know the whole story. Let me say that again. Sometimes people with different perspectives make us uncomfortable, especially if we don't know the whole story. The year that we lived in Morocco, we were staying there, especially the whole year, but it was the school year. And during that time, we had a friend of ours who we had been in a connection group with in Tucson, who was a teacher. And so during her winter break, she came over to stay with us in Morocco. Part of that was because she wanted to see us. Part of it was because there were several things that we couldn't get in Morocco that we could get in Tucson, like granola bars. And I really wanted a granola bar, really, really badly. And so she brought some of them over. And while she was there, her name's Hannah, and while she was there, my wife Morgan, Hannah, and I had been kind of exploring Morocco a little bit, and it happened to be that year that Sunday was Christmas Day. And so we decided that we would go to church together. And in Fez, Morocco, a little city of about 4 million people, there's one Protestant church that speaks English. And so if you want to go to church, that's where you go. And so we decided that day, and you can kind of see the map here. There's kind of a street there. There's a roundabout. We would keep on going. And actually, if you go much further, you get to the mall. And so we would get in a taxi. We would pay the taxi driver to drive us. But instead of them actually driving us to the church, they would drive down to the next intersection where it looks like it kind of turns back and drop us off because making that turn down the road by the church was a little bit complicated. So they get down, they drop us off at the corner. Hannah, Morgan, and I, we round the corner and we start walking towards the church. And then something happened that I can still see so vividly in my mind. As we looked down toward the church, we saw something like 10 or 12 men standing outside, wearing military fatigues, holding machine guns. And we were really scared. It was really, really scary. We were starting to think, like, do we continue? Do we just maybe walk? Like, hey, we were just going to the mall. Do we head back home? Maybe stream a service somewhere? What do we do? And as we were kind of doing this like shuffle and trying to figure out what was happening, it happened to be that right behind us, another family that we went to church with showed up. And I don't know if they could just like sense it or if they could see it or they could hear us, but they knew that we were afraid. And so they said, hey, those guys, they're not here to hurt us. I said, what? They're actually sent from the government to protect us. Because with all of the hostilities that were happening at that time between the United States and many countries in the Middle East, the government was worried that there might be some kind of a demonstration or there might be some kind of an act of violence. And so they had sent military to make sure that we were able to worship in peace. In a country where, for people who are from Morocco, it's against the law to be Christian. There was something that happened at that moment that was really, really shattering. Because these men who were there that day, who by law were not Christians, had been willing to put not only their own safety, but potentially even their own lives on the line to make sure that we, who were so privileged in so many ways, could worship in the way that we thought was best. Fortunately, most of the examples in our lives of not understanding the whole picture aren't nearly as extreme as this. But I wonder if maybe there aren't some things that we could learn, both from these men, but also from the Magi who were there that day. You see, they chose to do something that was unheard of. They chose to counter where they were comfortable at the risk of doing something that would make a bigger change. Look, it would not have been easy for the Magi at that time to come to Herod and say, like, where is the actual king? As Philip talked about last week, Herod was known as someone who did not want any competition for the throne. History tells us that potentially he had not only his wife, but his first 3 sons killed because he was afraid of someone trying to claim the throne. But I think, and I could be wrong, but I think that when we start to think about the whole story, we start to see beyond what is directly in front of us. When we challenge some of the biases that we have been raised around, maybe some of the biases that we perpetuated. I know that I have done some of these as well. I think in those times, we might start to see that we have so much more in common than we could ever have that separates us. And that's actually the second thing that I want us to think about today, and that's this: that love and care for each other is the main point, without the fine print. Let me say that again. This is really, really important. Love and care for each other is the main point, without the fine print. When the Magi had their conversation with Herod, he ultimately says that they can go on to wherever this child is and go see this child, this Jesus. And despite what most of our nativity sets look like, most scholars don't think that the Magi actually showed up with little baby Jesus in the crib. They weren't there at the same time as the shepherds. Most people think that, especially because it seems like Herod had all of the boys who were under 2 killed, that it was probably a couple of years later before the Magi got to where Jesus was. If the story was literal, it probably happened a few years down the line. And so I want you to see what happened when they got there. It says in Matthew 2, 9 through 11, that after this interview, the wise men went their way. And the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy, and they entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasure chest and gave him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. I'm not gonna lie, I've always thought this was a weird story. And I'll tell you why. If you can kind of picture in your mind, Mary and Joseph and a 2-year-old, right, like in their house, just kind of doing whatever like parents of 2-year-olds do. And then suddenly there's a knock at the door, and there's a huge crowd outside because even though we've often thought of like the 3 wise men, all we really know is that there were 3 gifts, so we have no idea how many people there were. So there were some number of people, along with their animals that they probably traveled with, in this giant treasure chest, and they're knocking at the door saying, I want to come in and worship your 2-year-old. It's a little weird. I know several parents of 2-year-olds, and there's a reason it's called the terrible twos. I don't know that many people are like, yeah, sure, come in and worship my child. So why does this happen? What's going on here? Well, one of the reasons that they may have been doing this is, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that they were Zoroastrians meant that they were probably just practicing their faith tradition. A big part of the Zoroastrian faith was focused on caring for others without any kind of a notion of trying to convert them, or without any reason of like, hey, you have to listen to this thing first, and then I'll give you something else. Dr. Kirsi Anita, who is widely considered one of the foremost experts now on Zoroastrianism, which is still practiced, by the way, worldwide. We imagine that there's something like 100,000 people who practice this religion currently, was recently giving a lecture about King Cyrus, who was a king in the Old Testament, responsible largely for the freeing of the Jews who were under Babylonian captivity. And I want you to hear what Dr. Anita says about the Zoroastrians. He says, almost everyone coming into contact with the Zoroastrians throughout the ages has made a ready observation about their humanistic traits. It was King Cyrus who freed the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. He made no attempt to impose his Zoroastrian religion on his subjects, but his inscriptions bear live testimony to the fact that he encouraged each of his subjects to live a good life according to their tenets. You know, one of the central tenets of Zoroastrianism was charity. And so when the Magi heard that the Jews were likely to be engaging in some kind of self-determination, they wanted to help support it. It doesn't say here that they were trying to convert Jesus or Mary and Joseph. It doesn't say, by the way, either that it went the other direction, that like Mary and Joseph tried to convert them to Christianity, which wouldn't have existed at the time anyway. Instead, what it seems to do is it seems like their goal was rather just to encourage the flourishing of those around them, whatever that looked like. And let me just say, one of the areas among so many that I am so proud of being a part of the venues here is that here at the venues, our goal consistently is just to make sure that the people of the 417 flourish without any of the fine print, without any questions about it. You know, I have been parts of churches in the past that would do things like go and feed our unsheltered friends, and they would say, okay, you can have this meal, but first you have to listen to this like 30-minute teaching. Ick, right? I mean, ick. When we serve people, our goal is to make sure their needs are met, period. Yeah, that is you. Thank you. When people are hungry, we want to make sure they have food. When people are thirsty, we want to make sure they have something to drink. When people are unsheltered, we want to make sure that during the crisis cold weather times that we provide shelter for them. And when kids at Studi need a backpack, we go above and beyond. Just literally, yesterday, I got an email from Kim about some of the ways that you all have been helping with Studi. In fact, because of your generosity, there was a need that had happened at the clothing distribution area at Studi where there was a big need for boys' pants because as it gets colder, people need to not wear shorts anymore. And because of your generosity and the way that you have done this, we were able to buy 88 more pairs of pants, which means that kids don't have to be cold. Thank you. Absolutely. Shorts are very cool, absolutely, and they can continue to wear them. We're not going to force anything upon them. But to paraphrase A very, very smart person. When we see people who are hurting, we never stop to ask if they are Christian or Buddhist or atheist or whatever. We just ask if they're okay. And you should be really proud of that. Here in Springfield. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Here in Springfield, I'm also honored to be the person who's kind of the leader of the Interfaith Alliance of the Ozarks. And it's an organization that gathers together every month on a Monday. In fact, we just had our meeting this last month, and there's a group of people from all kinds of different faiths who gather together. And one of the things that I love about the ways that we do things here is that we celebrate with each other when things are going well. For example, our LDS siblings are just building a new temple so that their people can worship more freely. I just heard about how our pagan community here in Springfield is going to be marching in the Christmas parade and celebrating some of their past. And even some of my friends from the Baha'i community were talking just with me the other day about how much we share in common. Because I think there are so many times whenever we realize that when we look for charity with each other, when we look to love each other more, I think there's something that is so much in line with what the Magi were doing, with what the narrative of Christmas is, with what it looks to show the Christ within us, that is so amazing. And there are so many people right now who get so frustrated during the season about things. And I want to share with you this, that we don't have to get upset about others wishing us happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas during this time. It's not a threat, it's an invitation. It's an invitation to charity. It's an invitation to see each other as people who want to make a difference. It's people saying, the Christ in me sees the Christ in you, the divine in me sees the divine in you, that people wherever we are already good, and we are better together. That we are already deserving of love just where you are, that you're already deserving of loving kindness just where you are. And that when things are bad, when people need to mourn, that we can do that together too. And there's a final reason for this, and that's this, that the divine is already speaking through each of us. The divine is already speaking through each of us. The way the story ends is that the Magi leave, and then instead of going back to Herod, they go back a different direction entirely. And I want you to see why, because this story used to really confuse me when I was a kid. It says this, that when it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. This part of the story was complicated for me as a kid, very complicated, and still a little bit complicated to me. I don't understand all of the dynamics here, but I'd been taught when I was a kid that God only hears the prayers of Christians. That the first prayer that God ever hears is when you ask Jesus into your heart. Made it really confusing to me how the Old Testament happened. It also kind of lines up with this meme. And it's the Flintstones, and it says this, seriously, what are they celebrating as they're walking around a Christmas tree? What it seems to say is this, that God spoke directly to them. It seems to say that there are echoes of love and the divine that are all around us. The Bible talks often about how the rocks will cry out. And I think there's this echo notion of that love is all around us. We just have to be ready to see it and embrace it. So maybe during the season, we can see it as a time to fully embrace those who would wish us a happy holidays instead of a Merry Christmas. Welcome it as an invitation to celebrate the divine in each of us. We're going to close today by listening to a little bit of a poem. And it's a poem by probably my favorite poet. Their name is Andrea Gibson. And the poem that we're going to listen to, they wrote and performed as part of their discussion as they'd been going through chemotherapy. And as they were going through chemotherapy, they started to realize that some of the people around them were wearing very overtly political attire. And it confused them as to why people would do that. Let me just say up front that obviously Andrea Gibson, like all of us, has a political bent. But this is not about politics at all. It could have happened the exact opposite direction. And while at first it does seem that they are a little bit frustrated at the people who are wearing that, I want you to think about this in this light. in much the same way that when I was at SBU, I was taught very specific things about people who I otherized. And it was only through personal experience that I learned to grow to love my Hoya. I think there's something really special that happens here as we watch their journey in the chemo room. So I want us to listen to this poem. At the end of it, I will pray, and then there will be a few minutes. If you have questions, we'd love to take some questions for you as well. So let's just listen to this poem for the next few minutes. We pray simply that this week we would live of natural causes, things like kindness, caring, and they would drive us to love and to see the love in each other. And it's in that name of love, the love that was demonstrated in Christ, we pray. Amen.